All right, it is 11 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. My name is Emily Scott. I am with the KY Innovation Office of Entrepreneurship in the Cabinet for Economic Development, and we thank you all for joining us. Today, we are going to have a webinar on supporting your science, building a strong team and environment, presented by Eva Garland Consulting.
All right, thank you for the introduction. As was mentioned, we're talking today about what it takes, your tricks and your practices to build a strong team and environment, because these are very key to having a strong competitive proposal. All right, we're not advancing for some reason. There we go. So these are our agenda items for today. So first we're going to talk about how do you actually build your team. Who do you need in place to be able to execute your proposal and have a strong competitive proposal? Since we are talking about small businesses, and this is SBIR STTR program, often the company doesn't have the capacity to do all the work. So kind of discussing whether that needs to be done and ways to work around that. And again, often these companies are very small and can even be virtual. So how do virtual companies end up having competitive application when it comes to your team and your environment? And then kind of coming back to number two, if you're not going to do all the work, can you actually outsource to a contract research organization and still be within the criteria for an SBIR STTR proposal? So we'll start with actually, how do you build your team? Now, first thing, before you can actually build your team, you need to know what are those blocks to building a team, and what are the rules, if there are any, that kind of have to be in place and that you have to follow as you are constructing your team. So there's the key components to your team are generally your principal investigator, you have other key personnel, and there's other personnel that are non-key. So with your principal investigator is primarily overseeing the program, and for the SBIR mechanism, the PI must be at least 51% employed by the small business concern that is submitting the proposal. For the STTR, your PI can actually be either from the small business or the collaborating institution. So if you have a subaward or such, which we'll talk about later, that person can actually serve as a PI for the proposal. Keep in mind that the PI has to commit at least 10% effort to the project, and I'm talking about the project that you're applying for. Excuse me. So they have to have at least 10% effort for the 6 months or year of the project. And then keep in mind, if it's SBIR and they're the PI, they then have to be 51% employed. So the other, 41% there, they can be paid by other means, but they have to be showed that they're at least 51% employed by the small business concern. And then for the actual project, they have to have at least 10% effort on the program. This can get confusing at times, so just again, make sure you're meeting these metrics when you're picking out your principal investigator. For other key personnel, this can be confusing as to who kind of falls in the bucket of other key personnel and who falls into other personnel that are non-key. So other key personnel are people that have specific expertise that are needed for the proposal. So it could be other company employees that maybe you've brought in someone who has done a lot of in vivo work in the past, or maybe someone who does regulatory stuff, or someone who has toxicity experience. Again, these can also be consultants. So consultants aren't, of course, employed specifically by your company, but you can bring them on an hourly basis, and they can fill those same gaps, whether it be tax or regulatory or product development, business development. And then also your other key personnel are going to be also from a subaward, if you have, for an STTR, your subaward, or you have a subaward on your SBIR. So again, these are people that have a specific expertise that you need for your program to have it be executed properly and have their input. The other personnel that are non-key, I generally think of these as like a technician level. So they're serving more as hands, but not really providing the expertise. So there could be a number of people that could fill in at that point. So you're not naming these individuals, but you're showing that you'll need a technician or two or a scientist to be able to actually do the bench work associated with the project. And keep in mind that all personnel in a phase one that are named as key personnel are going to be participating and being paid off of that from the budget. So there's going to be some level of effort, whether it be percent effort, as you would see with the key personnel and the principal investigator, or the other personnel that are non-key, or with consultants that you'll have some number of hours per the project period. So this flow chart here kind of gives you an idea of the organizational structure of a typical team for a proposal. So you're going to have your PI who's overseeing everything, and that person's going to work directly with the consultants, the subaward PI if there is one, and then any company employees that are serving as key employees. And then you might either have the non-key other personnel working under that person, or directly reporting to the PI, depending on how you got this structured. One thing I wanted to point out is the different colors. So the orange here is showing you who your internal team is, and then the kind of more brown is showing what your external team is. So this is going to come into play when you're looking at costs. So we're looking at your budget, and we're going to get into this more in a little bit. You're going to get into this a lot more with the seminar next month on budget, but whether or not they're internal or external determines on whether or not they're considered internal funds for the company or they're considered external funds for the company. So that you know the players of who should be on your team, now it's time to figure out how do you actually pick the perfect team. What are you looking for when you're trying to select your team members? So it really comes down to experience and expertise. So, for your experience, you want someone who can run the current program, and then also forward thinking as to what's coming next, because typically a lot of your team members that are on for phase 1 are going to stay on for phase 2. And of course, the team's going to change somewhat also with additional members for phase 2. But just, people that have done product development in the area that you're in and can show that they've been there and done that, to be able to show and prove to the reviewers that they have the expertise needed. And then generally for these proposals, there's a lot of science behind it. So you're looking for that technical expertise, but also you need to keep in mind that there is a product coming out of this. So reviewers like to see some business expertise for these proposals. And for phase 1, sometimes that can come from an incubator program where you can have advisors present, or it might be your PI for the project. It really just determines on whether or not your business expertise is leading it, or maybe a supplemental expertise. It depends on what is needed really for your program at that time. But just keep in mind that's just not science going on, that you have to remember you are developing a product, so you have to show you've got that expertise there too. So when you're selecting a PI, keep in mind that the PI is pretty much one of your most important people, as you're showing that, one, they have the expertise to drive the project, but also that they can manage a project like this where you have multidisciplinary sections going on. You've got a lot of moving parts, and of course you're trying to push this to a very aggressive timeline down to product development. So a PI should have, of course, the appropriate expertise, whether that be product development, scientific. And while you typically see that a PhD is in this position, it's not necessary. I mean, you just really need to show they've got the expertise there. They've done previous development, or they've got the scientific background, but they just have what's needed to be able to run that project that is being presented. It's great if the person has experience in running a grant-funded program, because that shows they kind of know the nuances and the ins and outs of it, and that this is something that's in their wheelhouse, and that the idea of running programs that are funded by NIH, NSF, or whatever dollars, they're able to stay in compliance and such. And of course, previous scientific successes. So, if you've actually had a grant-funded program that you've completed successfully, that kind of checks 2 boxes there. Having publications, patents, anything like that, to be able to show that they've successfully managed projects and have gotten it across the finish line. But not all companies have this type of person in place. So, what do you do if you don't actually have an experienced PI that you can easily name from your company? So I've definitely worked on projects that have been funded where the PIs were actually grad students kind of getting ready to graduate, and it was their technology, and they had their mentors there that could serve in a consulting role. So you can always have either someone who's more senior be an employee of the company, or serve as a consultant to help manage the project, or at least mentor the PI that you name, and give them some tips and kind of know how to be there to make sure it goes along successfully. You could also, if you're doing an STTR or you have some academic component to your proposal, you could have for an STTR, have the academic collaborator serve as the PI, so they can step in that role, and that's allowable for an STTR proposal. And if you, excuse me, also I've had it times where we haven't had the kind of the people in place yet at the company, but there's been someone who has agreed to serve as PI for the project once the project begins. And so you treat them as if you got their bio sketch in place. You have a statement in there saying that they will start the company once this award is in place, but they don't need to be actually committed to the company and already working there at the time of submitting the application. So once you have your PI selected and you'll know what expertise that person is providing, you need to start thinking about your other key personnel that will be in place for the proposal. So you want to think about what your program is and identify gaps that are there in the knowledge base based off of the PI or that you have in place for the program. So if you just kind of lay out your project, and if you're have some screening work going on, some in vivo work going on, or maybe you're building a prototype, there's a lot of engineering going on, just whatever the PI can't cover, you pretty much need to find a body to fill that void and have someone in place that has that expertise and experience to be able to oversee that part of the program. So in order to fill these gaps, again, it might fall into an academic collaborator. I do a lot of proposals where in vivo work is easy to get done from an academic institution, and that person brings knowledge of the model and has the experience of having run it before and just the infrastructure to already have that in place. So that's a good way to fill some of those gaps, is to have the academic collaborator. And often consultants are the other great way to fill some of these gaps, because you can find quite a few consultants to cover, like I said, with regulatory or tax or device engineering, product development, just whatever is needed to make sure that you're checking all those boxes of the gaps that you've identified. And for the consultants, they serve on an hourly basis and they give you their hourly rate, and it just kind of depends on the portion of the project that you need to fill, whether or not they're kind of 10 hours on that end for minimal need for the project, or it could be that they're working for several hours to be able to cover what's needed for the program. Once you've identified all your people and have pulled that team together, when you're writing your project or writing your proposal, all the different components that come together, just be clear and concise about who is doing what for the program. It's okay to have some overlap in people covering, so your PI and a consultant can be overseeing some studies together, but just needs to be very clear on who's covering what, just so the reviewers can judge if you have the expertise in place to execute the program. So generally, you're going to see in the research strategy, you might have a description of what individual is covering what portion of the program. And this should also be shown too in the biosketch. So your biosketch and your personal statement at the beginning should align with what you said the person is covering. And you also might see this stated again in the budget justification. So at that point, you want to just make sure all those documents are aligning as to what is being said that that person will be doing. So here's an example of what I would typically put in a phase 1 research strategy to describe the teams as I'm kind of introducing what the program, phase 1 program will be about. I'll always have a little blurb about the team. So this description states who will be directing it, who will be serving as PI, a brief description of their experience, highlighting what is necessary for the program. So this person has extensive experience in the pharmaceutical industry and will be responsible for project oversight, data interpretation, and lead selection. There's an introduction here of a professor who will then be completing some in vivo studies. And then there's some consultants listed that will be providing additional expertise and is stated as to what, what gaps they're filling. So there's a tax person and someone who would actually develop the technology. So that kind of gives you the idea of clearly defining where these different people fit in, so the reviewer knows who's doing what. And then again, like I said, if you have something like this in your proposal, make sure then your bio sketch aligns with this, and then also your budget justification if you're stating the roles in that too. So just a few frequently asked questions kind of along with this section. People a lot of times will ask, what's the typical number of personnel for a phase one? And there's no just straight answer for this. It will vary. You can have larger teams and smaller teams, but I would say I generally see 2 to 3 key personnel with possibly 1 other personnel. So you're going to have your PI with this, maybe a consultant or 2 to help round out the team, and then you usually have a technician that's going to be executing some of the studies. But again, this isn't something that's set in stone or a rule. This is typically what we see for a phase one, and a lot of it's dictated by the budget. You're not working with a lot of money typically for the phase one, so you can't have a huge team to be able, and support the science too. How can I afford the necessary expertise on the limited phase one budget? So kind of what I just said. Typically, it comes down to not being able to support a lot of internal employees, and that you can use consultants, which are typically going to be cheaper, to be able to support your core team that you have in place with the business. And then what type of business expertise do I need for a phase one? And I kind of touched on this a little bit. Limited business expertise for a phase one is fine, but you want to be able to note that you do have some support there. So if your PI is very technical and the rest of your team is very technical, which is often seen for a phase one, then make sure there's some mention of advisors that are available, or maybe a consultant, or relation to an incubator program that provides advisement for business development, just to show that that is in place, because while it's maybe not as important in phase one, it will become important in phase two. So you want to be able to show your reviewers that that already is in place for you to move on to after this project is done. How do I know if someone is key or other personnel? So just remember, we're talking about, key personnel have specific expertise needed for the program. So it's pretty much you need John Doe in there, and John Doe's the only person that's going to work for that, or very few people that would fill that role for you. While other personnel are kind of more technicians or scientists that could be filled by a number of individuals. So they're more serving as hands, not saying they're not critical to your company, but there's going to be a larger group of people that could fill that role for you. If I currently don't have an important key person, such as a clinician or an indication applicable to the technology, how do I find one? So this is a common problem where you're trying to, lay out your team, find your gaps. And a lot of times for a phase one, I like to have someone who is, the end user, maybe a clinician or such, that can advise on the use of your diagnostic or your therapeutic, just so that your development is kind of falling in place with what would be expected for the end user. And this is often a lot of times a tough person that could be to identify. You might not already have them in your network, but if you have a subaward with your project, a lot of times the subawards have a little bit larger network since they've already been in that area, so they might be able to identify this person for you. Your small business group might be able to help you, use their network to find some people. If you have any current investors or stakeholders, if you have board of directors in place, use the networks you've got out there to try to find these individuals. And also, you should be up on the current literature on your topic or your application. So if someone who is one of the topic experts, you could reach out to them and see if they would be interested in joining your team. All right, now we'll move on to does the company need to do all the work? The answer to this is no, but you have to be cognizant of the division of effort so that it matches the SBIR and STTR requirements. So we're going to touch on this a little bit, but keep in mind that this will be more thoroughly discussed in the budget seminar next month. So briefly, for the requirements for the company effort for the SBIR versus the STTR for phase 1, I have the little pie charts that you can refer to, or I also have it written out there at the very beginning, but 67% of the budget must go to internal expenses for the SBIR. And 33% of the budget can go to the external expenses for the SBIR. On the other hand, for the STTR, 40% of the budget must go to internal, while 30% of the budget must go to the subaward. So that leaves you with an extra 30% that could go either external or internal, but you have to be at least on that 40 or 30 for the internal and for the subaward. And this sounds like it could be a high metric to hit for some of these, to be able to get all your internal expenses if you're, virtual, don't do much research in-house, a very small company. But keep in mind when you're figuring what is internal and external, that your indirect expenses and your fee they are part of your internal budget. So that will be key to actually meeting that 67 or the 40% that you need to meet for the different programs. All right, so kind of back to, does the company have to do all the work? So no, of course you're meeting your 67 or your 40%. And then at that point, if you're going outside the company, you're generally looking at a collaborator, which would be a subaward, or a CRO, which we consider kind of a fee for service. This is how we kind of divide them up in, I guess, in our world, for our definitions, to keep them straight. So if you're looking at a collaborator, they're kind of be more appropriate for if they're doing a large portion of the project that's going to require them to have some special expertise, or if they're really putting a lot of intellectual input into the program, then this would be kind of more appropriate for a collaborator. So they're really working along with you instead of just doing something for you. They're really a part of the team. And it's great if you can have a well-known or established collaborator, because of course their expertise and experience will really enhance the team side of your proposal. But often the junior faculty are more willing to jump on to a project. They're kind of hungry to get pubs out, they're hungry to get money in. So you might kind of get more and better responses from junior faculty, and that's perfectly fine. And often if they're too junior, they're really new in their position, you could look into seeing if they can have a mentor serve in there as kind of a backup for them, to show that they have someone in place that has been there and done that. When you are selecting a collaborator, you want to make sure you have an introductory call with them, talk to them about the project, talk to them about their work, build that relationship up, talk about what you're hoping to get out of the studies that you're doing, what kind of timeline, just so they have a clear picture of what you're wanting. Because if you go into a relationship where the expectations are unclear, if that program is awarded, then it's going to be rough after that, actually getting everything executed. So it's best to get all that fleshed out at the beginning so that they know what needs to come from them in order to have this be a successful project. And it's for a subaward, it's great for a lot of these relationships because it really takes a lot of the writing burden off of you for preparing a proposal, because they can provide you with experimental details for their portion. Since they're the ones that's going to be executing that, they're going to have the best idea of all the minute details that need to be in there. And then also they have their institution that's going to be there to be able to provide the budgets, their bio sketches, facilities, equipment, and all these different documents. So they've got people working with them to get everything prepared. On the flip side, for a contract research organization or CRO, which we consider more fee for service, usually you have these involved when you're looking at routine work or studies. So anything that is kind of an off-the-shelf study that can be executed, that's when a CRO can fill this space, and that is then considered, it's a fee for service, is it considered company funds, so it'd be internal expenses. It's best to select CROs that are kind of more well-known and that of course are equipped to do the studies. If a reviewer kind of sees a no-name CRO, they might question them a little bit more whether or not they have the credentials to actually do the proposed studies. And then of course for working with a CRO, you want to make sure that you get a quote from them that has not only the pricing, but also the study details to make sure, again, the relationship is important here when you want to talk to them and make sure you really work out what you need in these studies. I'm just going to go through a few examples here of what could be a subaward or collaborator versus a CRO or fee for service. It's kind of a game you can play sometimes on what they'll let slide through as being considered a fee for service, so internal funds for the company. And I think it kind of varies per agency, varies per study section, varies across the board kind of who actually reviews and sees your grant and approves it for funding. So these are kind of broad examples, but you can kind of get into the weeds with this a little bit, trying to decide whether or not what would be more appropriate. But for these, for a development and execution of a specialized animal model, the key here is specialized. I wouldn't typically want to try to work with a CRO unless they have the history of really developing models. And this is more, to me, a job for an academic collaborator that might be kind of already doing these types of work. So this would be more appropriate for a subaward, because you're really going to have that intellectual input here as they're developing and executing this model, whereas a CRO, it's a little bit hairier relationship if they're going to be developing a model for you, kind of the back and forth. And again, if there's a CRO that is fine-tuned for this, that'd be one thing, but then they're going to fall still into considering this a subaward, even though a CRO is doing it, just because of the level of intellectual property. So execution of standard safety studies, this would be more of a fee for service or a CRO. So you can easily almost just go to their websites for a lot of them and say, I want an acute toxicity studies. You'll have to hash out, of course, your route of administration, how many days, your any special endpoints, but it's fairly standard that a CRO can easily do this, and this would be considered a standard study and fee for service. That would be a part of internal funds for the company. Execution of pilot human studies to examine performance of a prototype. This could really go both ways for a CRO or a subaward. There's plenty of CROs out there that can do these types of studies, but you might find, just to build your team up and to have access to the patient populations that you want, this would be a good study for a subaward also, because they could bring, one, the expertise in the clinical area that you're looking to apply the prototype to, and then also they have the patient population easily accessible. So production of a device component from a set protocol. This would be a CRO. This is something where you're pretty much handing them everything. You're handing them the protocol, you're handing them the how to, giving them all the specs, and they're just doing it. So it's kind of, there's turning the crank to be able to get your component out. So this would be considered a CRO or fee for service. All right, so some tips to working with collaborators and CROs. So just keep in mind, I guess, in general, when you're working with a CRO and a collaborator, is that these are not internal working people for you. So you have less control over them because they're not your employees. So at times it can be like herding cats. So as I talked about before, having those relationships kind of built up and expectations set. So that's part of engaging them early. Get the study design set. Make sure everyone agrees on them. Make sure you've got every step in there, from how the study will be initiated, what are the schedules for it, what are your endpoints, just so everyone's on the same page with everything. And remember, this takes time to get these set up, and then also for either a subaward to get a budget done or a CRO get a quote done. It still takes time for them to get this in place and get this figured out. So we always like to start these several weeks out to engage these people so that you can have these discussions and they can start working on their numbers. If you are going the collaborator route, the pre-award office is managing a bunch of different individuals within that institution. So your pre-award office is who works with the PIs of the subawards and yourself as a business to be able to get the paperwork together to do a submission. So they have multiple academic researchers that they're working with for each grant cycle. And so sometimes I've had it where they can turn something around in a week, but generally, you're looking at least reaching out to them a month or more before. I've had some that require at least everything being to them with 2 weeks prior to the deadline. Then of course you want to set your deadline from the documents from them to be, at least a week away from the actual deadline, just because you want to get those documents back. And I always try to make it at least a couple weeks from the actual deadline to get like budget items from them, just because then you need their final budget numbers to figure into your budget so that you complete your documents. So just as you're kind of adding in all those different times is, really backs you up to, contacting them as soon as possible to get everything rolling. And when you're selecting who you're going to go with for Collaborator or CRO, do your research. Look at publications or posters from collaborators. CROs will also, of course, have publications and posters. You can go on to NIH Reporter, type in the academic PI's name and see if they've been on a grant before, so you can kind of get their grant history and see what they have out there and what they have rolling out. Gives you an idea of their experience having grant-funded programs. And then remember to always go back to knowing your requirements for what kind of mechanism you're applying for. So as you're setting up your collaborations and your CROs, get those budget numbers early so you can make sure that you're fitting either the SBIR or the STTR requirements that's appropriate for whatever mechanism that you picked. And as you're doing this, that means obtaining the right documents too. So you don't really have to worry about budget items, but with a collaborator, you're going to have bio sketches and facilities and equipment information, and then also a letter of intent from the university. And the letter of intent is pretty much kind of the last thing that they send out to you, because at that point they've checked all the budget stuff and they're signing off on the fact that they agree to the collaboration that you guys are proposing. All right, so a few more FAQs. So a lot of times people are trying to decide what they should go for, an SBIR or STTR. And then, it comes down to multiple variables as to what we should select. One is the division of work. Are you going to be doing a lot of CRO work or in-house work? So CRO work that is going to qualify as fee for service, which would be internal funds. Then you can likely go the SBIR route because you'll be able to hit that 67%. If you're going to have a large portion of the work done by an academic collaboration, then you're likely going to go the STTR route, because then you only have to hit the 40% for the internal. It could come down to PI selection. If you got the expertise in place within your company, then great. And you of course, can check the other boxes, then an SBIR might be appropriate for you. If you don't have expertise within your company, you're going to have to use your academic collaborator as a PI, then of course you need to fall into the STTR mechanism at that point. Another variable that can help decide this is what your team looks like in general. So if you've got enough employees that can kind of cover all the expertise and advisors, then you can go the SBIR route. Otherwise, if you're going to have to pull a lot of expertise from your academic collaborator or from an academic collaborator, then you're likely going to fall more into the STTR route, because they're going to be using a bigger portion of funds to help round out your team, because they'll have some other key personnel likely besides just the PI. Another question we get a lot is, what if personnel don't want to be employees? So a lot of times these small businesses are kind of pulling in people that have, maybe already commercialized something, have been consulting, and you wouldn't have pulled them in as being an actual employee, but they may not really want to commit to that at this point. They can serve as a consultant. That's your first option, is just having them as a consultant. So they're not going to be considered part of internal expenses, but they're still a part of your team. So that's perfectly fine. Yes. Keep in mind though, consultants are kind of easier to pay, and it's usually an easier relationship to have. But when it comes to compliance, as you move into your phase 2 grants and maybe multiple grants, just want to keep in mind that employees are, of course, easier to manage because they're under your control, but also they're kind of cleaner for compliance reasons. They're just kind of, the agencies generally like kind of cleaner books that come from actually having employees. So, as we mentioned, they don't have to be employees until it's time of award. So just keep that in mind, that as you're moving down, that maybe someone would come in, be a consultant for phase 1 and then actually come in as an employee for phase 2. So there's multiple options there. All right, so the next item on the agenda is, how does being a virtual company affect my application? And we work with a lot of virtual companies. This is very, very common. So you're not alone if you're thinking this really aligns with your thoughts right now. But, challenges that are faced by these virtual companies include, there's limited environments because they don't hardly exist. So there's no facilities. They're not doing any of their own research in the company. There could be one person just running it, maybe two. There's just, the team is very small. And because they don't have facilities, they have a small team, pretty much everything they're getting done is being outsourced, whether it be with academic collaborator or, CROs. Pretty much everything is being done elsewhere. And keep in mind that reviewers may see this as a weakness because the whole idea of the program is to promote small businesses. So their idea is to have a small business actually grow into a larger business. But plenty of virtual companies are able to kind of maneuver around this, and there are practices and solutions to address enhancing the presentation of the virtual companies so that you have a competitive proposal. So the first thing is, how does a virtual company enhance the environment of that company? So you're going to have description of facilities, of course, within your documents, so your facilities and other resources. If you're virtual, you might just have an office space, if anything that you can describe, but lean on your incubator program. So if you're a part of an incubator program, describe everything that incubator program has. And depending on your letter constraints with the type of agency you're applying to, you might be able to then have a letter included from that incubator space supporting the fact of what you said in your facilities of everything that's accessible to you. If you're having a subaward on your proposals, or you're going the STTR route, be sure to include the facilities from your collaborator, because that's enhancing your environment. It's showing you've got what is needed to actually execute the studies. And also your CROs. You can definitely put your facilities and other resources on there from your CROs, again, to show that they have the facilities in place to execute the proposed studies. And another thing that's important, if you are working with an academic collaborator or even your CROs, researchers like to see that you're in close proximity if possible, especially if it's a collaborator you're really going to be working with a lot. So if you're within just a few miles of the collaborator, can have a lot of in-person meetings, or can be over there as they're executing studies, be sure to highlight that you are just in close proximity to that collaborator. The next thing is how to enhance as a virtual company, you can expand your team. So even though you're that one person sitting there in that small office, you can add other key personnel to join the team at the time of award. So they're not going to have anything significant contribution before, but they're filling those gaps and those holes that we talked about earlier that can come in. They can have a commitment at the time of award to actually join your team. If you're doing the STTR route, you're going to have the subaward PI, so that's building your team out too and augmenting the expertise of your internal team. And then also, as I mentioned before, consultants are a good way to fill gaps. So even though it's just you at that virtual company, just making sure you have all those gaps filled will look as if you're expanding your core team in your company. So increasing internal effort, this goes back to, with virtual companies, it's a struggle to show you have the resources, it's a struggle to show you have the people, but it's also a struggle to hit those metrics for that 67% or that 40% for the SBIR and STTR that you have to have for your internal expenses. So one of the big things is having to actually get the budgets appropriate so that you're able to increase the internal effort to meet those metrics. So ways to do this include, renting a small lab space to perform a portion of the work. You don't have to already have that rented. Again, if you're able to have multiple letters within your application, it's good to have a letter from where you're going to rent that says, what all is included within that space. It's great if it's a space that comes with some kind of core facilities or access to core facilities, maybe at a university that's nearby or such. And that's, again, kind of falls back on the incubator spaces a lot. But just keep in mind that don't have to start this lease until the time of award. I've also had situations where companies are working kind of with a smaller CRO to where the PI from the PI can actually kind of oversee the work at the CRO, or other company personnel can kind of help to manage that. So that increases your effort level then. So the CRO is having to have more input from you and more guidance and more oversight. So then you can increase the effort level of the PI or the other key personnel that you have doing that. And then the other thing, this is what gets a little tricky and can be hairy, is CRO work may be able to be considered fee for service. So CRO work that is what we've discussed being kind of off the shelf stuff, very standard, very typical work, that can be considered fee for service. Therefore, it's an internal expense. And generally, as I'm talking about this in my budget and such, which you'll get into, like I said, next week, I actually use a term that, whether it be Charles River will be executing X as under a fee for service agreement, just to kind of throw it out there that I'm considering this fee for service, therefore it's an internal expense. So even if you don't have the lab space to perform these typical studies, they can still be treated as internal effort under a fee for service agreement. All right, and then to kind of expand on that last bit about the fee for service, can I outsource to a contract research organization? Again, yes, we have that but. So the but is just make sure you mind those budget restrictions. So you've got 67% going internal, 40% going internal for the SBIR and STTR, and of course you have your external caps too. Have a well-planned study design. So even if you're working with a CRO and they're kind of off-the-shelf studies, just make sure you're getting everything you want. Make sure everything's spelled out and that you've got initiation, timeline, endpoints, everything there that's written out on paper. And then even though they're going to be executing the studies and they are standard studies, make sure there's someone in the group that can oversee those studies. That they have the expertise to manage those, have done similar studies, can interpret the data, can make sure the study design is accurate and is going to get you what you want. So in thinking about working with a CRO, first, shop around. Make sure you like the people you're going to work with, give multiple quotes so that you have something that seems like it fits within your budget. And also, it's just good to have a backup because, as I said, these can take some time. So if someone's dragging their feet on getting you a quote, you might have another one come in to be able to take the place of that one. Choosing an established CRO that has expertise in the studies that you're doing is of course good to have, just because it's going to give reviewers confidence that they can execute the study as you proposed. A nice to have is that they've worked on grant funded projects previously, just so they understand the fact that you might need a lot of information from them right now, but they're not getting any money until this project comes online if it gets awarded. So the familiarity is helpful, but it's not necessary. It's especially helpful if you're doing animal studies because they are then aware of what kind of animal care questions they have to ask for this, or have to answer for the submission. And keep in mind when you're looking for a CRO that for the SBIR STTR programs, all work must be done in the US unless you have a very strong scientific justification why you can't do it in the US. And if you're thinking about proposing a foreign entity to do some work, it's just best to talk to the program officer. Budget is not a strong justification. It needs to be something more along the lines that no one else in the US has these cell lines or has access to some other reagent or has this model, or but it's just best to see if the program officer agrees with your use of your foreign entity. And then again, as if I haven't said it enough, just make sure you remember your requirements for the internal versus external percentages as you're kind of selecting who's going to do what for your work. So when you're pulling together your application, just keep in mind the items that you need from your CRO. So talk about quote and statement of work, making sure early on that you're getting that defined. Make sure the quote has clear pricing. I've had some applications I've been on study section where you're trying to figure out if the budget's right, but you can't really tell how much a study's going to cost because it's line item with a bunch of different things. So just having a clear quote as to what they're doing in a statement of work to make it easier on the reviewers. It's nice to have a facilities description from them that you can include in your facilities and other resources, especially if they're doing they have special equipment or something that you need to kind of show they have that there. But also if you're a virtual company, then you can show that you've got the resources available through the CRO. Human subjects and vertebrate animal, if you're going to use either of these, then the CRO is going to have to provide the appropriate documentation for these. And then letter of support, again, this is not necessary, but it's a good way for the CRO to highlight their expertise and their commitment to the project. So in conclusion, do team and environment really matter? And that's a big yes. All agencies are judging your team and environment as a measure of your program quality. So you could have a really cool technology, a great approach for trying to develop it, but if your team and environment aren't solid, then your plan is useless pretty much. So a good plan is going to get scored lower just because your team and your environment aren't in place to execute it. So the reviewers are going to question your abilities. So the next steps, now that your proposal is coming together, it's time to start thinking about the budget. So please join us again on July 16th for the next webinar, which is titled Budget, Translating Science to Dollars. So you're going to hear a lot more of the budget lingo that I kind of started dabbling in and the requirements and also restrictions. So we look forward to having more people on then. Any questions? All right. I think with the silence and the no questions popping up in the little box, I will take that as a no. And just note that I'm available, for additional questions that you can email through Kip, and they can pass along to us and get some answers for your questions. But I thank you all for your time and look forward to having everyone on again next month.
Thank you, Angie, and everyone for joining us. We will see you next time.